Imagine stepping outside, and suddenly, you're followed by eagles. Yes, eagles. These incredible creatures flying overhead, watching your every move. Sounds like something out of a story, right? But for one man, this strange thing is real, and the reason why will leave you stunned. This is John, a man who spent his life in the wilderness of Alaska, living close to nature. But what makes John stand out isn't just his love for the land. It's the eagles that follow him everywhere. Whether he's fishing by the river or hiking through the snow, there they are, always above, always watching. Why do these eagles seem so drawn to him? What could explain this strange connection between man and bird? The answer will completely change how you think about wildlife. John was born deep in the wilderness of Alaska, far from the bustling cities and the chaos of modern life. His childhood was not filled with toys, gadgets, or schoolyard games. Instead, John's earliest memories were of the woods, the rivers, and the animals that called this wild landscape home. He was taught by his father that in this environment, survival didn't depend on how strong you were, but on how well you understood and respected the land. From a very young age, John was introduced to the harsh beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. His father, a skilled trapper and fisherman, would take him out into the forests, showing him how to read the land. They would track animals, identify edible plants, and set traps to catch food for the family. His mother, a quiet but strong woman, maintained the household by gathering resources from the land, preserving food for the long winter months. In this remote corner of the world, John quickly learned the importance of living in harmony with nature. John's childhood wasn't like most kids. While children in the city were playing sports or spending hours indoors, John spent his days outdoors, learning survival skills, observing the behaviors of animals, and becoming one with his environment. He learned the rhythm of the seasons, the arrival of spring's warmth, the long nights of winter, and everything in between. He didn't just live alongside nature, he became part of it. As John grew older, he began to understand the deeper lessons the wilderness had to offer. Nature was not just about surviving, it was about respect and coexistence. The forests, rivers, and mountains were not separate from him, but rather they were part of the larger web of life that connected all living beings. John learned to identify animal tracks and scents, to predict the weather, and to move silently through the woods. But more than just practical knowledge, John developed a deep spiritual connection to the wilderness. It was his home, his sanctuary, and his teacher. Over the years, John developed a quiet, unspoken understanding with the animals of the region. He didn't view them as mere creatures to be hunted or observed from a distance. He saw them as partners in the great dance of life. Each animal had its role to play in the ecosystem, and each played its part in maintaining the balance of nature. John spent hours watching the animals, learning their habits and understanding their behaviors. He knew where the bears liked to scratch the trees, where the moose went to drink at dusk, and where the wolves traveled under the light of the moon. John learned to move with the animals, to blend into his surroundings, becoming an invisible observer of the wilderness. He never approached the animals unless it was necessary, always respecting their space. He came to understand their habits, and in return, they came to understand his presence. In time, John became part of the landscape, as much a part of the wild as the rivers that flowed through it, or the trees that towered above. One of John's earliest memories was of watching a mother bear and her cubs from a distance. His father had always taught him to respect the space of wild animals, so he knew better than to approach. From a safe distance, he watched as the mother bear led her cubs to a river, teaching them how to fish. John felt an immense sense of awe and respect for this creature, who, like him, relied on the land to survive. It was moments like these that taught John the importance of maintaining balance and harmony in the wilderness. John had always been drawn to the eagle. It was one of the most powerful, majestic birds in the wilderness, and yet, it had always seemed distant. He had seen eagles fly overhead, perched on high branches, and watched them hunt for food, but the eagle had always remained out of reach. a creature of strength and independence. It simply existed, watching from above, as aloof and majestic as the mountains themselves. John had always admired the eagle. Its wings, stretching wide as it soared through the sky, its sharp eyes scanning the land below, all seemed to symbolize the power and beauty of nature. But as much as John admired the eagle, it was also a symbol of something beyond him, something that was untouchable, elusive. The eagle had always remained a mystery. For years, John watched the eagles from afar, fascinated by their grace and power. But no matter how much he admired them, he never thought they would become part of his life. Eagles were creatures of the sky, free and untamed. They had their place in the world, and John had his. But little did he know that the eagle would soon become a guiding force in his life. It all began one clear winter morning when John was in his late 20s. He'd been out early, checking his traps, but the weather had started to change. The sky darkened and the wind picked up. He paused, taking a deep breath of the cold, crisp air. The winter was harsh, but John had seen it all before. He was used to the storms, the freezing temperatures, and the isolation. But that morning, something felt different. It wasn't just the weather, it was the feeling that something unusual was about to happen. As he walked through the woods, John spotted a familiar shape in the distance. A large, majestic bird perched on a nearby rock. But as he approached, he realized it wasn't just any bird. It was an eagle. And it wasn't perched high up on a tree as eagles usually did. This one was close to the ground, barely a few yards away. It looked up at him with intense eyes, as if waiting for him. John stood frozen, not sure what to make of this encounter. Eagles were known to be solitary creatures, often keeping their distance from humans. This eagle, however, didn't seem afraid. It didn't fly away when John approached. Instead, it remained still, its gaze locked onto his. John slowly took a step forward, his heart racing. He had spent his whole life in the wilderness, but this felt different. He had never been so close to an eagle, and there was something about the bird's presence that made him feel a deep sense of connection. The eagle didn't move, didn't flinch. It simply stared at him, as if waiting for him to make the next move. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. John was mesmerized by the eagle's piercing eyes, its powerful wings tucked neatly against its body. The bird was magnificent, unlike anything he had ever seen. And for a brief moment, John felt as though they were connected. Two creatures, bound by the wilderness, observing each other, understanding each other. But then, the eagle took flight, soaring into the sky with incredible speed and grace. John watched as it disappeared into the clouds, feeling a sense of wonder and awe. The encounter had been brief, but it left an impression on him. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that something significant had just happened. At first, John thought it was just a coincidence. But over the next few days, the eagle began to appear more and more. It didn't matter what John was doing, whether he was chopping wood, fishing by the river, or checking his traps. The eagle was there. Sometimes it would land nearby, watching him with its sharp, intelligent eyes. Other times it would circle overhead, always keeping its distance, but always present. John was no stranger to animal behavior. He had spent years observing the creatures of the wilderness, learning their habits, their patterns. But this was different. The eagle wasn't just watching, it was engaging with him. It wasn't afraid, and it wasn't just passing by. It seemed to have a purpose. It was a copper box. The eagle appeared every time John was alone. It seemed to choose its moments carefully, waiting until he was in the quiet of the wilderness, when the world felt still. And each time the eagle would appear, its powerful wings cutting through the air, its eyes locked onto John. John began to wonder, why was this eagle so drawn to him? What was it trying to tell him? He couldn't shake the feeling that the eagle was guiding him, leading him toward something. He tried to ignore the growing sense of curiosity that was building inside him, but he couldn't. The eagle had become a part of his life, and he had to know why. Over the next few weeks, John couldn't shake the feeling that the eagle was more than just a curious animal. The bird had started appearing at the most unexpected times, just when John was in the deepest parts of the forest, or when he was tending to his traps. The eagle didn't seem to be following him out of instinct. It seemed deliberate, almost like it was watching, waiting for something. At first, John tried to ignore the strange connection he felt growing between himself and the eagle. He was a man of logic, someone who had learned to read the signs of nature, to understand the world through observation and experience. But this was different. This bird, with its piercing gaze and quiet presence, seemed to be trying to tell him something that John couldn't yet understand. One day, John was walking along a narrow trail that led to his usual fishing spot by the river. He had been out in the wilderness for days, working on some repairs to his cabin, and was eager to relax by the water. He had packed a small lunch and was planning to enjoy the peaceful solitude. But as he approached the riverbank, he felt the familiar presence of the eagle watching from above. He glanced up and saw it, soaring high above the treetops. The bird's eyes were locked onto him, its wings cutting through the crisp winter air with ease. John paused and watched the eagle as it circled overhead, almost as though it was waiting for something. He had the strangest feeling that the eagle wasn't just observing. It was waiting for him to make the next move. It wasn't until the storm hit that John truly began to wonder if the eagle's presence had a deeper meaning. The weather had been unpredictable that week, with sudden bursts of snow and gusty winds. John had been out on his usual route, checking the traps and ensuring that his shelter was secure, when the storm began to escalate. The wind picked up quickly, and within minutes, the once clear sky turned gray, blanketed with heavy clouds. The temperature plummeted, and the snow began to fall in thick sheets. John knew better than to take chances in the wild. When a storm hit, it could be deadly. He immediately started to head back toward his cabin, but the storm made it nearly impossible to see. As the wind howled, John realized how disoriented he had become. The world around him had transformed into a blinding white blur, and the trail he had been following was now hidden beneath a thick layer of snow. His footsteps were being covered within minutes, and the cold began to seep into his bones. That's when he heard it. The powerful beat of wings cutting through the chaos of the storm. For a moment, John thought he was imagining things, but then he looked up. There, above him, cutting through the snow and wind, was the eagle. It was flying low, almost as though it was guiding him, leading him through the storm. John had always trusted his instincts in the wild. He knew the land, the animals, and the rhythms of nature. But he also knew when to admit that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't just a coincidence. The eagle had appeared at just the right moment, and for some reason, it felt as though it was helping him find his way. Without thinking, John began to follow the eagle, trusting it to lead him through the storm. He struggled through the deep snow, his body exhausted from the cold and the relentless winds. But the eagle continued to guide him, circling above, dipping low, as if showing him the safest path. After what felt like hours, the storm finally began to die down. The wind slowed, and the snow began to ease, leaving a quiet, still landscape in its wake. John could barely feel his fingers or toes, but he pressed on, knowing he had to find shelter. The eagle, still soaring above, guided him toward the edge of the forest, where John spotted something unexpected: an old, weathered cabin hidden in the trees. John had never seen this cabin before. It wasn't on any of the trails he had used, nor did he remember coming across it in his past excursions. But the eagle seemed to be leading him straight to it. He approached cautiously, unsure of what he would find inside. Was it abandoned? Or was someone else living there? When he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, his exhaustion weighing heavily on him. But the eagle had flown ahead, perched nearby, as if waiting for him. With a deep breath, John pushed open the door and stepped inside, seeking warmth and safety. The interior of the cabin was simple but welcoming. It was clearly not a place for everyday living, but rather a refuge, designed for someone who ventured deep into the wilderness. The firewood stacked neatly by the stove, the blankets piled on the bed, and the few shelves of supplies all indicated that it was a temporary shelter, one meant for those who needed to escape the elements. John collapsed on the floor, his body sore and cold. But despite his exhaustion, a sense of calm washed over him. The eagle had led him here. He wasn't sure why or how, but he knew that the bird had saved him. Without its intervention, he might not have made it through the storm. As he rested, John felt a sense of connection to the eagle, more powerful than any feeling he had experienced before. The bird wasn't just a creature of the wild. It was a guide, a companion, sent to show him the way. John couldn't explain it, but he knew deep down that this wasn't just a random encounter. The eagle had played a part in saving his life. After the storm had passed and John had rested in the cabin for a few hours, he decided to venture out and explore the area. The eagle, as always, was nearby, watching from above. John knew that he couldn't ignore the strange series of events that had unfolded in the past few days. The eagle, the storm, the cabin. It all seemed too much to be just a coincidence. As he wandered through the snow-covered forest, John stumbled upon something that took him by surprise. Strange markings carved into the bark of trees. These weren't random scratches or natural patterns. These were deliberate symbols, etched into the wood with precision. Some of the markings were simple, while others were more intricate, forming a series of interconnected lines and shapes. John had spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize patterns in nature, but these markings were something else entirely. They weren't the work of animals or weather. They were man-made, carved with purpose. As he examined them more closely, John felt a strange sense of recognition, as if he had seen something like this before, but couldn't quite place it. The eagle appeared again, circling above John's head, as if urging him to continue. Without fully understanding why, John decided to follow the trail of markings deeper into the forest. The eagle flew ahead, as though guiding him once more, leading him toward an answer that John didn't yet know he was searching for. The markings led John through the dense forest, toward the base of a mountain. As he approached the rocky slope, he noticed that the trees seemed to be arranged in a specific pattern, as though they were guiding him toward something. The eagle remained overhead, circling in the sky, keeping a careful watch on his movements. After climbing for what seemed like hours, John reached a clearing at the top of the hill. There, nestled among the rocks and trees, was a hidden structure, a research facility. The building was cleverly camouflaged to blend into its surroundings, with walls covered in natural materials that made it nearly invisible from a distance. John approached cautiously, unsure of what he would find, but as he drew closer, he realized that this wasn't just any research facility. It was a high-tech operation with solar panels, satellite dishes, and other advanced equipment hidden within the landscape. John's heart raced as he realized what he had stumbled upon. A secret research facility, studying the very animals he had spent his life observing. But how did it connect to the eagle? What role did this facility play in his mysterious encounter with the bird? The eagle had led him here, but to what end? John didn't know yet, but he had a sense that this discovery would change everything. Inside the research facility, John was shocked by what he found. Monitors displayed live data on animal movements, tracking the behavior of species across the region. Cameras were set up to observe animals in their natural habitats, recording footage of wildlife as it interacted with the environment. There were even cameras focused on John's own interactions with the eagle, something he hadn't even realized was being monitored. Dr. Angela Roberts, the lead scientist of the facility, greeted John warmly when he arrived. She explained the purpose of the facility. It wasn't just about observing animals. It was about studying how humans and animals could work together to protect the land. The research was focused on human-animal partnerships, exploring how animals like eagles could be involved in helping humans preserve and protect natural ecosystems. Dr. Roberts explained that the eagle's behavior wasn't random. It had been part of a carefully monitored study, one that had involved John without his knowledge. The eagle had been trained to guide John and other researchers through the wilderness, showing them the safest paths and even helping them find hidden threats to the environment. John was stunned. He had never imagined that his connection with the eagle was part of something larger, something so profound. The eagle hadn't just been following him. It had been working with him, helping him in ways he couldn't have understood at the time. John stood at the entrance of the research facility, staring out at the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly before him. The eagle, ever watchful, soared high above, cutting through the crisp air with ease. As the wind gently whipped around him, John felt the weight of everything that had happened in the past few days. What had started as a strange encounter with an eagle had now become something much bigger. This facility, hidden deep in the wilds of Alaska, was a center of revolutionary change in the world of conservation. The research conducted here wasn't just about protecting animals from human activity. It was about creating a new partnership between humans and the natural world, where animals like the eagle didn't just survive, but helped humans survive too. For years, John had lived alongside the wilderness, a solitary observer of nature's incredible complexity. But now, as he walked deeper into the research facility, he realized that his life, his understanding of the wild, was about to change forever. Grado was about to spend the next hour in his life. Dr. Roberts, the lead scientist, had given him a tour of the facility, showing him all the high-tech equipment, data monitors and cameras that had been set up to track animals, analyze their behavior, and measure how these creatures interacted with their environments. But beyond the data and the monitors was a broader vision, one that reached far beyond Alaska. "This isn't just a project for us, John," Dr. Roberts had said, her voice filled with excitement and urgency. "What we're doing here has the potential to change the way we understand conservation. It's about a partnership, a cooperation between humans and wildlife. We're not here to dominate or control nature. We're here to protect it. And we need the animals and they need us." John couldn't quite grasp the full scale of what Dr. Roberts was saying, but he knew one thing for sure. The idea of working with nature, rather than against it, resonated deeply with him. This was a vision he had never considered before, but it felt right. It felt like the future. Over the next few days, John became more familiar with the project's scope. He learned that the research being conducted at the facility wasn't isolated to this one location. The ideas and methods developed here had already begun spreading to other parts of the world. Dr. Roberts explained that similar projects were underway in Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America, all with the same goal: to use human-animal cooperation to foster better conservation practices. "We're working with elephants in Africa," Dr. Roberts explained. "We're training them to help us monitor poaching activity, track their own herds, and identify areas that need conservation efforts. The elephants are helping us protect themselves, and, in turn, we're providing them with the resources they need to thrive." John was amazed. He had heard stories of elephants being used in conservation work, but he hadn't realized how advanced the research was. The idea of working directly with animals to preserve their habitats was groundbreaking. It wasn't just about saving the animals. It was about empowering them to protect their own futures. In Southeast Asia, the project was focused on protecting tiger habitats. By monitoring the movements of tigers through GPS collars and collaborating with local communities, scientists were able to reduce human-wildlife conflict and prevent poaching. The tigers, once seen as a threat to humans, were now being recognized as valuable allies in the fight to protect the forest ecosystems they inhabited. Meanwhile, in South America, researchers were working with jaguars to monitor their territories. Jaguars were being tracked using advanced technology that allowed conservationists to understand their movements, their hunting patterns, and their interactions with other wildlife. The data gathered from these efforts was being used to establish wildlife corridors, safe spaces where the jaguars could roam freely without the threat of habitat loss or human intervention. "Each of these projects is part of a bigger picture," Dr. Roberts said. "We're not just saving individual species, we're saving entire ecosystems. If we can learn to work with the animals, to help them help us. We can change the way conservation is done. John felt his heart swell with hope. He had always respected the wild, but now he was beginning to see how much more was possible. The idea of animals working alongside humans was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality, and it was spreading. As John spent more time at the facility, he began to reflect on the bigger picture. The idea of humans intervening in nature was something that had always bothered him. He had grown up with the belief that nature should be left untouched, that the wild should remain wild. But now, as he saw the progress being made and the results of the human-animal partnerships, he couldn't help but wonder, were they doing the right thing? What if we're changing things too much? John asked Dr. Roberts one evening as they sat in the facility's lounge. What if we're disrupting the natural order, even with the best of intentions? Dr. Roberts paused, considering his question carefully. But what if animals become dependent on us? John asked, still unsure. What if they start relying on humans for their survival instead of living freely in the wild? Dr. Roberts smiled. That's the balance we're working to find. The goal is not to make animals dependent on us. It's to empower them, to give them the tools they need to survive in a world that is changing rapidly. We're not taking over their world. We're trying to make sure they have a world to live in. John considered this for a long time. He knew that the wilderness was changing. He had seen it with his own eyes, the changing seasons, the shrinking habitats, the encroachment of human development. Maybe this new approach was the only way to preserve what remained of the wild. But it was still a lot to process. As the days passed, John began to see just how integral technology was to the success of the research. The facility was equipped with state-of-the-art tools, all designed to help track and monitor wildlife behavior. GPS collars on animals, motion sensor cameras, drones to survey the land. These technological advancements allowed scientists to gather data in real time, providing them with insights that were previously impossible to obtain. We're using technology to create a real-time map of the ecosystem, Dr. Roberts explained. We can track the animals, monitor their health, and even see how they interact with their environments. This data helps us make better decisions about conservation efforts. John was fascinated. As someone who had spent his life in the wilderness, he had always relied on his instincts and experience to navigate the land. But now, he saw how technology could enhance those instincts, giving researchers a clearer picture of what was happening in the wild. The combination of human knowledge and technological advancements was proving to be a powerful tool in the fight for conservation. Over time, John found himself becoming more involved in the research. He had spent years observing the animals in the wild, but now he was part of something much bigger. His first-hand knowledge of the land, combined with the data gathered from the research facility, was invaluable in helping scientists understand the behavior of the local wildlife. The eagle, once a mysterious creature that had simply followed him through the wilderness, now seemed like a symbol of everything the project stood for: human-animal cooperation. John had learned to trust the eagle, and now he was learning to trust the larger project. "This is bigger than just us, isn't it?" John said to Dr. Roberts one evening as they reviewed the latest data on animal behavior. "This is about saving the entire ecosystem, about making sure that both humans and animals can survive together." Dr. Roberts nodded. "Exactly. The work we're doing here is just the beginning. If we can prove that humans and animals can work together, maybe we can show the world that there's another way forward. A way that's not just about protecting nature, but about learning how to live with it." John smiled, feeling a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he believed that the future of the wild wasn't lost. It wasn't about fighting nature or trying to control it. It was about working together, for the sake of the earth, for the sake of the animals, and for the sake of humanity itself. John had spent most of his life observing the world around him, a silent watcher of nature's delicate balance. He had grown up with a deep respect for the wilderness, feeling more at home with the animals and the land than with other people. He had always viewed the natural world as something sacred, something that should be left untouched by human hands. For years, his connection to nature had been one of quiet observation. He learned to read the land, the rhythms of the seasons, and the habits of the animals that called the Alaskan wilderness home. John had built his life around this quiet understanding of the wild, content in his solitude and his intimate knowledge of the world around him. But as he stood in the research facility, staring at the data collected from across the globe, he realized that his perspective had begun to shift. What had started as a simple, unexpected encounter with an eagle had opened his eyes to a whole new way of thinking about conservation. It wasn't enough anymore to simply observe the world. If he truly cared about the survival of the creatures he had spent so much time watching, he needed to take action. The idea of human-animal cooperation had begun to take root in his mind, and he couldn't ignore the call to be part of something larger. John's time at the facility had given him a sense of purpose. He had always been connected to the wilderness, but now he was beginning to see that this connection could evolve into something more meaningful. This was no longer just about protecting nature from the outside world. It was about actively engaging with nature to protect it. John had always thought that conservation meant leaving nature untouched, but he now saw that it was more complex than that. The eagle that had followed him, the connection they had shared, was more than just a random event. It was a call to action. John could feel it deep in his bones. He had a role to play in this new approach to conservation. The world was changing, and he needed to be a part of it. As John became more involved in the research facility, he realized that the work being done here was groundbreaking, but it wasn't without its challenges. The more he learned about the global efforts underway, working with elephants in Africa, tigers in Asia, jaguars in South America, the more he understood that these human-animal partnerships were delicate. The balance between respecting nature and intervening in it was a tightrope walk, and one misstep could have disastrous consequences. John had always believed that humans had no place in the wild, that nature should be left to function on its own, without interference. But now, as he saw firsthand how collaborative conservation was helping to restore ecosystems and protect endangered species, he understood that this was a new way of thinking. Conservation through cooperation was the way forward, but it required careful management. There were, of course, ethical dilemmas that came with this new approach. Was it right to intervene in nature? Would the animals become too dependent on humans? Was there a risk of disrupting their natural behaviors? And if so, how much intervention was too much? John grappled with these questions daily. He spent hours in the research facility, reading the latest data and discussing the ethical implications with Dr. Roberts and the other scientists. It became clear to John that this work wasn't just about saving species. It was about rethinking our relationship with nature. Humans had always been a disruptive force in the natural world, but now, with this new model, they could be a force for good. The key was finding the right balance between intervention and respect. But as John saw it, the scale had tipped so far in the other direction over the years, toward destruction and exploitation, that finding a solution was worth the risk. The animals, John realized, had their own intelligence. They could help themselves, but they also needed humans to be their partners, not just their protectors. The trick was learning to work together, to create synergy between the two worlds. The success of the research facility in Alaska was only the beginning. The model of human-animal cooperation was spreading around the world, with new projects being launched in regions where wildlife was under the greatest threat. John had the chance to speak with researchers from Africa, Asia, and South America, each one eager to learn from the work being done at the facility. In Africa, we've been using elephants to help monitor poaching activity, Dr. Roberts explained. The elephants are being trained to track their own herds, alerting us to poaching hotspots. We're not just using them as tools, we're working with them, helping them help us. John listened, amazed by the progress that had been made. The idea of animals actively participating in their own protection was revolutionary. But it wasn't just elephants. Similar projects were being implemented in other parts of the world as well. In Southeast Asia, researchers were working with tigers, monitoring their movements through GPS collars, and learning how to prevent human-tiger conflict. In South America, jaguars were being tracked using the same technology, with the data being used to create safe corridors for them to roam freely without fear of habitat destruction. John had never thought about conservation in such a broad sense. To him, it had always been about the animals in his immediate environment, but now he saw that conservation was a global effort, and it was up to everyone, scientists, conservationists, and even ordinary people like him, to work together to make it a success. One of the most striking things about the work being done at the facility was how much technology was being used to track and study wildlife. From GPS collars and motion sensors to drones and satellite imaging, technology was playing a critical role in monitoring animal movements and mapping ecosystems. The data collected was being analyzed in real time, giving researchers insights into animal behavior, migration patterns, and habitat use. As John became more familiar with the tools and systems in place, he was struck by how advanced and integrated the technology was. It wasn't just about collecting data. It was about using that data to make better decisions for both wildlife and humans. We're using drones to survey the land and track large animal movements, Dr. Roberts explained. This gives us a bird's-eye view of their habitats, showing us areas where animals are thriving and where they might need more protection. John was fascinated by the possibilities. The ability to track and study wildlife in such detail was something he had never imagined. As a man who had spent his life in the wilderness, relying on his instincts and experience to navigate the land, John now saw how much more could be accomplished with the help of technology. Real-time data was giving researchers a clearer picture of the world's ecosystems, and that data was being used to create targeted conservation strategies. In a world where climate change, deforestation, and human encroachment were rapidly changing the landscape, the need for precise monitoring had never been greater. Technology, when used responsibly, could help conservationists stay ahead of the curve, identifying threats before they became insurmountable. As John spent more time at the research facility, he realized that his role was evolving. He had always been a part of the wilderness, but now he was becoming an active participant in something much larger. The knowledge he had gained from years of living in the wild, his understanding of animal behavior, his ability to read the land, was invaluable to the team. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of the effort to save the wilderness. John began working alongside the researchers, helping them map wildlife corridors, track animal movements, and identify areas where conservation efforts were most needed. He felt a deep sense of purpose as he worked with the scientists, knowing that his involvement was making a difference. The more he learned about the global conservation network, the more John realized how interconnected everything was. Conservation wasn't just about protecting isolated species. It was about protecting entire ecosystems, and that meant working together across borders, across countries, and across cultures. John's perspective had shifted from that of an outsider looking in to a vital player in the global movement. It wasn't just about protecting the wilderness. It was about preserving the world for future generations, both human and animal alike. As John stood on the edge of the wilderness, looking out over the vast expanse of land that had shaped him, he realized just how much he had changed. The man who had once lived in isolation, content to watch nature unfold around him, was now part of a larger effort, a movement that could change the future of conservation. John had always believed that nature should be left untouched, but now he saw that the future of the wild depended on human involvement. This was no longer about domination. It was about collaboration. It was about recognizing that humans and animals were not separate entities, but part of the same interconnected web of life. The eagle, once a symbol of the untamed wilderness, had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that, even in the face of immense challenges, there was always a way forward. John smiled, watching the eagle soar high above him, knowing that the future was in his hands and the hands of those who were willing to work together to protect the world. John stood at the edge of the wilderness, his eyes tracing the vast horizon that stretched before him. The winds whispered through the trees, the snow falling gently on the ground around him, and the birds, the eagles especially, soared high above. As he looked out over the landscape, John couldn't help but think back to the years he had spent in the wild, to the man he had once been. A man who viewed nature as something to be respected from a distance, but never fully engaged with. Now, everything was different. The journey he had undertaken had transformed him in ways he could not have predicted. The same wilderness he had once navigated alone, quietly observing the behavior of animals, was now a place where he was an active participant. He had spent his life learning the rhythms of the forest, the patterns of the seasons, and the movements of the wildlife that inhabited it. But now, he understood that survival was not only about the ability to read the land or understand the animals. It was about finding a way for humans and animals to coexist, to work together to protect the world they both shared. The connection he had once felt to the wilderness had evolved into something deeper, something more profound. It wasn't just about protecting nature from human hands. It was about integrating humans into nature's systems, in a way that respected the autonomy and the rights of the animals that had taught him so much. John was no longer just an observer of the wild. He had become a guardian, a protector, and a partner to the very creatures he had watched from afar for so long. This new role, though challenging, had opened his eyes to a reality he had never imagined, one where humans were no longer the enemies of the natural world, but were instead active participants in its preservation. The world was changing, and John knew it. The animals he had lived alongside were facing challenges greater than ever before. Deforestation, climate change, poaching, these were all threats that couldn't be ignored. For years, he had watched the slow and steady march of destruction, feeling helpless. But now, standing at the forefront of a movement that sought to reverse the damage, John had a newfound sense of purpose. The global conservation movement had already begun to grow, expanding into areas of the world where wildlife was most vulnerable. From the elephants of Africa to the tigers of Southeast Asia, to the jaguars of South America, this movement was taking hold in regions where human activity had been encroaching on animal habitats for centuries. John had spent time working with researchers, scientists, and conservationists from all over the world, each of them bringing their own experiences and perspectives to the effort. In Alaska, the project to protect the local wildlife had reached new heights. The eagle that had once watched John from the skies was now symbolic of a new kind of partnership, one where animals and humans were no longer seen as separate, but as part of the same natural order. The research facility where John had spent so much time was no longer just a place of study. It had become a beacon for global change, and now John was a key part of that effort. His time in the facility had been a revelation. He had worked side by side with the scientists, using data collected from wildlife tracking, motion sensors, and drones to monitor the health of ecosystems across the world. He had seen firsthand the effects that human intervention, when done responsibly, could have on wildlife populations. He had seen species that were once on the brink of extinction begin to flourish again. Many people find that separating from nature for extended periods and to working hard, habitats that were once decimated begin to flourish again. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. John's role in these efforts had evolved into that of a liaison, someone who could bridge the gap between scientific research and local communities. His firsthand knowledge of the land and his deep understanding of the creatures that lived in it made him an invaluable resource. As a lifelong resident of Alaska, John was familiar with the unique challenges that arose in trying to protect wildlife in such remote and often harsh environments. But now, as part of the global movement, he could help spread the message of conservation through cooperation to regions where it was most needed. His time in the facility had been a revelation. He had worked side by side with the scientists, using data collected from wildlife tracking, motion sensors, and drones to monitor the health of ecosystems across the world. He had seen firsthand the effects that human intervention, when done responsibly, could have on wildlife populations. He had seen species that were once on the brink of extinction begin to flourish again. Many people find that separating from nature for extended periods and to working hard, habitats that were once decimated begin to flourish again. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. John's role in these efforts had evolved into that of a liaison, someone who could bridge the gap between scientific research and local communities. His firsthand knowledge of the land and his deep understanding of the creatures that lived in it made him an invaluable resource. As a lifelong resident of Alaska, John was familiar with the unique challenges that arose in trying to protect wildlife in such remote and often harsh environments. But now, as part of the global movement, he could help spread the message of conservation through cooperation to regions where it was most needed. John still had questions. Was it possible to protect the wild without trying to control it? Could humans become part of the solution without overstepping their bounds? The balance between intervention and respect was delicate, and John was still uncertain about where that line should be drawn. Dr. Roberts, the head scientist at the facility, often spoke to John about the ethical questions they all faced. She acknowledged the challenges, but reminded him that doing nothing was no longer an option. "John," she had said one evening as they reviewed the latest findings, "we can't keep pretending that we can step away from nature and leave it to fix itself. The damage we've done is too great. If we don't intervene, if we don't step up and help guide this process, there may not be anything left for future generations. It's about empowering nature, not controlling it. We have to help the animals help themselves." One of the most significant advancements in the conservation movement was the integration of technology. The research facility in Alaska had been instrumental in using cutting-edge technology to monitor wildlife and ecosystems. John had spent countless hours reviewing real-time data, tracking the movements of animals through GPS collars, and using motion sensors to monitor animal behavior. Drones had provided aerial surveys of large habitats, allowing researchers to map out ecosystems with incredible accuracy. But it wasn't just about collecting data. It was about using that data to make informed decisions. The technology allowed scientists to predict animal migration patterns, identify areas that were at risk of destruction, and detect early signs of disease or distress in wildlife populations. By using data-driven methods, researchers could ensure that their conservation efforts were focused in the right places at the right time. John had always been a man of instincts. He had learned to read the land and the animals through years of experience. But now, he saw the power of combining those instincts with the insights provided by technology. Together, the two could create a holistic approach to conservation that was more effective than either method alone. "This isn't just about what we can see with our eyes," Dr. Roberts had explained one day as they reviewed satellite images of the area. "It's about using technology to understand patterns that aren't immediately visible. It's about seeing the bigger picture." As John became more involved in the research, he saw how his role had shifted from an isolated observer to a global advocate for conservation. He had always thought of himself as a man of the wild, someone who lived close to nature, away from society's noise. But now, he understood that his place in the world was more than just an observer, something that had the potential to change the future of both humanity and wildlife. John began to travel with the research team, visiting other conservation sites around the world. From Africa's savannas to Asia's jungles to South America's rainforests, John saw firsthand the challenges that wildlife faced in every corner of the globe. But he also saw the hope that came with collaboration. Everywhere he went, he saw communities working with animals, using technology and data to create safe spaces for wildlife to roam freely. Through his travels, John learned that the key to successful conservation wasn't just about protecting animals. It was about working with people. The local communities were the real heroes of the movement. They were the ones living alongside wildlife, the ones who had the greatest stake in preserving these ecosystems. The researchers and conservationists couldn't do it alone. They needed the cooperation of local populations to make real, lasting change. John began working alongside local leaders, helping to build bridges between conservationists and communities. His experience in the wilderness, his deep understanding of animals and ecosystems, gave him a unique ability to communicate with people in these communities. He wasn't just an outsider coming in with new ideas. He was a part of the fabric of the land, someone who had lived and worked alongside nature for years. His involvement with the project was crucial in creating a global network of conservation efforts that spanned continents. One evening, after returning from a trip to Africa, John sat by the fire at the research facility, reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey he had embarked on had not only changed his life, it had changed the world. The movement for human-animal cooperation was growing stronger every day, and John had played a key role in it. As he watched the flickering flames dance in the fire, he thought back to that first encounter with the eagle. It seemed like a lifetime ago, when he had been a man alone in the wilderness, unsure of his place in the world. Now, John understood that his place wasn't just in the wild. It was in the world, a world where humans and animals could live and thrive together. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had also been one of discovery, growth, and hope. John had found a new purpose, a purpose that extended beyond his own life and touched the future of the earth itself. He smiled to himself, knowing that his journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The eagle, once a symbol of mystery, was now a symbol of hope. The work that John had started was a small part of a much larger movement, one that had the power to change the future of the planet, one partnership at a time. This section of the interview is now linked to the recent Reentry website. John's journey has shown us that the future of wildlife conservation isn't just about protecting nature. It's about learning to live alongside it. The bond between humans and animals can go beyond coexistence. It can be a partnership that helps preserve the ecosystems we all rely on. If you believe in the power of cooperation between humans and wildlife, now is the time to take action. Share this story, and let's spread the message that we all have a role to play in protecting our planet. Like this video if it inspired you, and subscribe for more incredible stories of nature and the people working to protect it. Share your thoughts in the comments below about how we can all help ensure a future where both humans and wildlife thrive together.